So the United States really has no response to any of this that is throwing a scare into pretty much anyone at this point. And again, this goes back to a fundamental problem with the West. We are so self-obsessed. We are so pathetic in terms of what we believe our role on earth is. We can't even unify around what our chief philosophy is. We can't even unify around the idea that the United States has a history that is worth revering. We can't unify around the basic idea that our principles are better than the principles of other countries around the world, which, by the way, they are. That's not chauvinism. That is just reality. But we can't unify around that. Instead, what we're mostly focused on is, can the government cut us more checks? Because we have not prepared ourselves in any way for a global conflict of any size or scale. We have not prepared ourselves for an unfriendly world. We have been the stupid, fat, happy kid walking around the playground with pockets full of candy, chomping and hoping that the bully is not going to knock us down and take our candy. That's what we have been, because after all, we were the bully not all that long ago, right? We were the most powerful kid on the playground. But here's the thing. You can be the most powerful kid on the playground, but if you don't work out, if you don't have the mindset, if you're not willing to defend yourself, somebody's going to knock you off your feet. And that's what Russia and China are preparing to do right now. We've not taken any of the measures to ensure if you actually saw the world as a rough and tumble place, you know what you wouldn't do? You wouldn't blow out the national debt to the tune of $30 trillion for no apparent reason. You wouldn't focus on reorienting the military around woke values. You wouldn't worry about masking toddlers, right? These are all things that do not bespeak a country worthy of its greatness. They don't. We are so navel-gazing. We're so narcissistic. We're trapped in our own reflection that we're not even around to realize when everybody else is challenging us on the world stage. And I know there are a lot of people who are saying, well, why should I care about Ukraine? Why should I care about Taiwan? Why should I care about these places? Because your safety and your security and your prosperity are reliant on a global system. And that global system is maintained by American hegemony. And when that hegemony goes away, the system is not going to maintain. Things will get worse in your life. You will have more expensive products at the very least. You will have more threats on our foreign borders. You will have more problems globally in the supply chain. You like the inflation right now? Wait until the supply chains are being throttled by our enemies. Wait until it's China not just taking over Taiwan, but then threatening Australia. Wait until it's Russia not just taking over Ukraine, but threatening all the rest of the Baltic states. And the Europeans kowtowing to it. The global system matters because we live in a global system, and pretending otherwise is thinking before airplanes existed. Certainly before the internet existed. And again, we're all complaining about the inflation right now. That's a supply chain problem created by the pandemic and then exacerbated by overspending in the United States and loose Federal Reserve monetary policy. Wait, what if it's purposeful? Wait until that happens. It's all fun and games until things get real, and things are beginning to get real right now. But we are not treating the world with any sense of seriousness. When you lose your higher sense of purpose, it turns out that cannot be regained by a simple appeal to hedonistic check cutting. Right now, according to the Wall Street Journal, the national debt this month reached $30 trillion. This is Jeb Henserling writing for the Wall Street Journal. Not only is this the largest debt in U.S. history in dollar terms, the ratio of debt to gross domestic product is now 119%, the largest it has ever been, and things are only getting worse. The CBO predicts that the mammoth debt to GDP ratio will double over the next 3 decades. The Highway Trust Fund will likely become insolvent in 2027, Medicare Part A will run out of money in 2026, Social Security will go completely bust in fiscal 2033. Now Americans are beginning to experience inflation, one of the primary costs of rapidly growing levels of national debt. Every day we hear supply chain challenges and the pandemic are to blame, but those aren't the only culprit. To help finance $5.9 trillion of COVID relief, the Federal Reserve purchased Treasury debt from third parties, typically large banks known as primary dealers. And then with a few keystrokes, the Fed simply created a new set of credits on its books for the sellers. Because the additions of these credits in 2 years, the Fed's balance has doubled to almost $9 trillion, creating a risk of significant and sustained inflation. Some policymakers and economists maintain that sustained harmful inflation can never happen here. They argue the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Investors will continue to purchase Treasury debt as long as they believe they'll get their money back. But what happens if the national debt makes bondholders begin to question that proposition? What happens if the American economy stops growing? If we have a weak economy, if we overspend, if we treat our economy as a grab bag of cash filled with free money, guess what? We are not making ourselves strong enough on the world stage to withstand any sort of real conflict. If we distract ourselves with all this stuff, then we give up our claim to be a global hegemon. And when we do that, by the way, there are costs. There are real world costs, not just in human lives around the world and U.S. military lives that will be lost, but also in terms of the quality of life in the United States. We are blessed to, we were born on third base, most of us, and think we hit a triple. And we think, okay, what if we steal second? What if we just go back and undermine the very foundations of the world order that has created our prosperity? What if we just give up on those? And then we'll see and this is what Putin is basically saying. He's challenging us right now. That doesn't mean that we have to go to outright war because, let's face it, Ukraine is already pretty much gone. Okay, sanctions are not going to stop Putin from doing what he wants to do. The question is going to be, what do we do with the next thing? Do we allow China to take Taiwan the way that we've allowed Putin to take Ukraine? Or do we ship in more weaponry than God has ever seen into Taiwan and damn the consequences with regard to China? Do we start cutting China off at the knees economically? Do we stop their intellectual property theft? Do we treat our enemies like our enemies? Or do we keep signing ridiculous deals with Iran with the help of China and Russia? Do we keep focusing in on how to reimagine capitalism, which is something that the left has been very focused on? Instead of unleashing the power of the American economy, American innovation, and ingenuity, we've been focused on what kind of checks can we cut to people to stay home? How can we reimagine capitalism on a global scale to cut down on innovation and redistribute? The Wall Street Journal has an interesting piece today about the Hewlett Foundation. It says the 20th century economist Joseph Schumpeter famously wrote that capitalism sows its own destruction by creating a knowledge class who despise its success. Behold the Hewlett Foundation and Omidyar Network's $40 million gift to the paupers at Harvard and MIT to reimagine capitalism. The press release says, for more than 40 years, neoliberalism has dominated economic and political debates, both in the U.S. and globally, with its free market fundamentalism and growth at all costs approach to economic and social policy. It offers no solutions for the biggest challenges of our time, such as the climate crisis, systemic racism, and rampant wealth inequality, and in many ways, it has made those problems even worse. If you think these are the worst problems on earth, climate crisis, systemic racism, and rampant wealth inequality, you are a first world person who does not understand how the actual real world works. It's our stupid focus on the so-called climate crisis that has led Europe to be completely dependent on Russian natural gas. These things are not disconnected. We're so busy focusing on the alleged systemic racism of America's police forces that we've forgotten about the fact that, our enemies are committing actual genocides in places like Xinjiang. But again, we have too many navel-gazing rich people over here who are perfectly happy to undermine the foundations of their own society. As the Wall Street Journal says, Joseph Schumpeter predicted that people in the comfortable West, including tech entrepreneurs, would take prosperity for granted. And that's exactly what is happening. By reimagining capitalism, as the press release advertises, what these foundations really mean is putting politicians and the administrative state in charge of redistributing more of its proceeds. But if they'd been paying attention in recent years, they might have noticed free market fundamentalism could have spared the United States from some terrible mistakes. But they don't care about sparing the United States from terrible mistakes. They think that the mistake is the system. People on the left make fun of people on the right for pointing out things like, why are you so focused in on social policy in the United States when there are threats abroad? Why do you think it matters? Why do you focus in on silly stories about transgenderism and transgender swimmers and gender ideology and the indoctrination of our children? Because when your society that is so engrossed in your own navel, you destroy the institutions that made your freedom possible, and you undermine freedom around the world. That's why. If you're a weak, pusillanimous society, you will collapse. Going all the way back to the Bible, when God suggests Yeshurun got fat and kicked, what he means is that when you get fat and when you get happy and when you ignore what you had to do to get there, when you ignore your fundamental principles and your higher purpose, the predictable result is that you lose and bad things happen. And that's precisely what the United States has been doing for decades. Until the end of the Cold War, at the very least, we had the ability to look at the Soviet Union and say, we're standing up to those guys. That's our existential purpose. But then the Cold War ended. And the question became, what comes next? What are we going to do? What are we going to become? Now, what we could have done is we could have stayed lean and mean. We could have maintained our muscular military. We could have maintained a robust economy focused on innovation. To a certain extent, we did some of that in the 1990s. But instead, we decided not to do that. We decided that it was much more important for us to become basically post-World War II Britain. We were going to look inward. It was time to look home. And it was time to redistribute the gains. And it was time to think about what the next stage of capitalism would look like, a nicer, kinder, gentler world. Here's the thing. The world does not get kinder. It does not get gentler. It does not get nicer. You just get weaker. And when you get weaker, the bully takes your lunch money. Who's got two thumbs and wants you to like and subscribe?